This is the DJI Air 2S, which I've been using for a couple of months now since it first came out, and I bought it to replace my Mavic 2 Pro, which I've been using for about 3 years since that came out, on various photography trips and to shoot video B-roll and things like that. Now, I wasn't really intending to do a review of this drone, but I'm here in Iceland at the moment. I've been here for about a week or so with a workshop and been using this drone a lot and quite intensively and getting a lot of questions about it from the workshop participants. So I thought it might be interesting and useful to get down my thoughts, to talk about why I switched, why I use this drone, what are the advantages and disadvantages I found in comparison with the Mavic 2 Pro. And yeah, just to go over what I think you can expect when you get a drone like this. Now, my use case is that I'm a landscape photographer, principally shooting with my cameras, and I use a drone to give me a different perspective and also to shoot short clips and B-roll and things like that. So it's not the primary tool in my bag, but it's something that goes with me everywhere, and I do think the drones are pretty much essential. I really do love the kind of images, the perspective that they give you. I think they're wonderful for landscapes, particularly somewhere here like Iceland, where we can be right out in the wild, far away from people and civilization, and just get some really nice images, some really nice perspective that you simply can't get when you're standing on the ground with a tripod. So I think that's a really good tool, and I've been using drones since the first Mavic came out, since the Mavic Pro came out, which I thought was a wonderful drone. My issues with it were the small sensor. It gave me a lot of noise and wade in the videos. It didn't really handle low light particularly well. When the Mavic 2 Pro came out, I thought it was an absolutely perfect drone. I've never had any issues with it. For me, DJI hit it out of the park. It's a great drone that I would still be using now. The only improvement that I ever wanted from the Mavic 2 Pro was that DJI could make it smaller and lighter, which is kind of what they did with the Air 2S. It has the same sensor. It's pretty much the same optically as the Mavic 2 Pro, and that was something that really appealed to me. In terms of the weight difference, the Mavic 2 Pro is about 900 grams. This is a little bit under 600 grams, so you already save about 300 grams, which is the weight of a small lens. But when you're out in the field, you're always going to be carrying at least 3 batteries. And then when you start to factor in the battery weight as well, this still weighs with 3 batteries less than a kilogram, whereas the Mavic 2 Pro goes up to about 1.5 kilograms. So you've got more than 0.5 kilogram in extra weight with that drone, which for me makes a difference. I'm typically out on long hikes, like on this trip we've been doing 10 or 15 kilometers a day up hills. So saving weight is really important, particularly because this isn't the only thing that I've got in my bag. I've also got a couple of cameras and lenses and a tripod and stuff like that. So I really do appreciate the fact that it's smaller and lighter, and it's something that's really paid dividends a lot on this trip, and I've really noticed. It is significantly smaller than the Mavic 2 Pro. When you see them side by side, it does feel like the baby brother. And my friend's been using his Mavic 2 Pro on this trip, and I've not really noticed any difference in performance at all, in terms of the wind performance, in terms of the battery performance, in terms of the range. So we've been flying in some quite high winds out over places like the volcanic eruption, getting the drones to some quite significant heights and a long way away where we've been getting wind warnings, and this has always given me a really rock steady image, and I've had quite a lot of confidence flying it. Now, I'm not a naturally confident drone flyer. That I do tend to get quite nervous when I'm getting wind warnings when the drone's really a long way away, when it's about 1.5 kilometers away, hovering over a volcanic crater. That kind of makes me nervous. So I do find that I've trusted this drone every bit as much as a Mavic 2 Pro. And my friend who's been out with his Mavic 2, we haven't noticed in terms of battery life. We've been taking off pretty much at the same time, getting the warning alert at pretty much the same time, and bringing the drones back with a very similar amount of battery life left. Wind hasn't affected. We've both been getting wind warnings at about the same time and have a similar level of stability. So I don't feel in practical performance that you lose anything with this drone. I think DJI rated it for 32 minutes or something in terms of battery life, but as everyone knows, what DJI say a battery will do is really not what a battery will actually do. That's rated in perfect conditions with a right level of humidity and ambient temperature and absolutely no wind. In real terms, flying this in windy places, flying it in colder places, you can expect something about 26 or 27 minutes of flight time. Now I've also noticed it's, in terms of the speed and things like that, it's every bit as fast and capable as the Mavic 2 Pro. It gets me where I want to go when I put it in sport mode, if I want to fly it out a long distance to start shooting. That's really great. It is super fast. It's very nippy and agile. The ascend and descend speed seem to be faster than the Mavic 2 Pro. I really do like that. It really does feel incredibly easy and intuitive to control. There's a level of what's the word that I'm looking for? You really do feel more connected to it. It's a little bit less sluggish than the Mavic 2 Pro, and that was by no means sluggish. It's quite a nippy drone. What I did notice is that in what on the Mavic 2 Pro is tripod mode, and here they've called Cine, it doesn't actually move as slowly. Now, I quite often like to move the drone very slowly if I'm flying between trees or things like that. If I'm flying over things, I want the drone to move very slowly, particularly if I've got the camera pointing straight down and if I'm moving backwards. But the speed of this in Cine mode, in its slow mode, is a little bit too fast. The Mavic will actually go a little bit slower. So that is one issue that I've had with the drone. In terms of the sensors and things like that, this does lack sideways sensors on the side, which the Mavic 2 Pro has. It has sensors on the top, sensors on the back, sensors on the front and the bottom, and all those are great. I found they perform really well in picking up objects and stuff like that and avoiding them. I'm not someone who has the drone following me through trees, so I can't comment on that, but generally in terms of not crashing into stuff, it is really excellent. But I do miss not having the sensors on the side. I have to be honest. If you're using the drone to circle at all, so if you're doing panning shots sideways, if you're locked onto a fixed target in the landscape and you've got the drone circling, then that lack of sideways sensors is an issue, and it's something that I have to be very aware of when I'm moving the drone sideways that I didn't have to really worry too much about with the Mavic 2 Pro. Now, in terms of the image quality and the sensor and stuff like that, I'm not going to do side-by-side microscopic comparisons. There are loads of those already on YouTube. What I can say is that the fact that this shoots 4K 60 and the Mavic 2 Pro tops out at 4K 30 does help, because it means that you can film a little bit high speed and then slow that frame rate down in post to 30 frames per second. So that's something that I find really useful. And as I said, it has the same sensor as the Mavic 2 Pro, but it uses the sensor differently. The Mavic 2 Pro is 4K and it has two modes. So what it does, because the sensor is a 20 megapixel sensor, which is actually more pixels than you need for 4K, it does two things. It can crop into the sensor, shooting 4K, but not using all of the sensor, or it can use the whole width of the sensor, but not every single pixel. So you're not getting all of the resolution that the sensor is capable of. And I think that's probably down to do with data transfer speed. The Mavic 2 Pro tops out 100 megabytes per second, but this is 150 megabytes per second. So it can transfer that data from the sensor a little bit faster. Because what this camera does is it uses the whole of the sensor, so you can shoot at 5.7K, giving you more resolution to play with in post-processing. So you can crop into that image and still have 4K, which brings objects a little bit closer if you want to. It's incredibly useful, and the 5K footage does look really, really great. So that's a great thing. In terms of the still photography, it's 20 megapixel, the same as the Mavic 2 Pro. So you're not going to notice any difference at all in the still images that you take with it. Another thing that I really like about this is the fact that the camera has a wider angle lens, wider angle view. This is about 22 millimeter equivalent, and the Mavic 2 Pro is about 28 millimeter equivalent. That's full frame 35 millimeter equivalent. So that wider field of view really does help quite a lot, because whenever you're flying the drone, basically the camera is pointing straight in front of you. You can't really point the camera up because of the propellers. Now, I shoot around mountains a lot, which meant with the Mavic 2 Pro, I quite often couldn't get the tops of the mountains in. It was quite often cropping them off unless I got the drone really high, which you're not allowed to do legally. There's a 120 meter altitude limit in most places in Europe. So shooting the tops of mountains was quite problematic if you were close to it. You had to go a long way back to get the whole of the mountains in, but then you lose something in the foreground. This slightly wider field of view really does make a difference in terms of photographs and in terms of videos. You get a lot more landscape in, you get a wider sweep of the scene, And it allows you to get the tops of mountains and also get the tops of mountains or figure in the landscape much easier. So I do really like that. And if you have any problem, if it's too wide, if you're shooting at 5.7K, you can quite easily crop in to give you that narrower focal length or crop into the 20 megapixel images. So in terms of the camera, for me, it's better than the Mavic 2 Pro. The video, I think it's better than the Mavic 2 Pro because of the additional resolution and the fact that it can shoot 4K 60. Now, one of the things that I have seen that people are concerned about online is the lack of a variable aperture on the Air 2S compared with the Mavic 2 Pro, which has a variable aperture. Now, in terms of still photography, it really doesn't matter at all because aperture doesn't work in the same way on a drone as it does in a real camera. You don't have to worry about depth of field from a drone because your subject is always a long way away. You're shooting things on the ground. So to have a fixed aperture at f2.8 is perfectly fine. It allows you to get the maximum amount of lighting possible, so you don't have to worry about increasing the ISO or having longer shutter speeds. So the variable aperture, you don't need to change the aperture when you're shooting still images, but where variable aperture does matter is when you're shooting video, because if you're shooting frame rates of something like 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, you really want to be able to double your frame rate to keep smooth footage, something like 1/50 or 1/60, because having a little bit of blur in each individual frame actually gives you smoother footage. If every one of your images is pin sharp at 1/500, the footage starts to feel a little bit more jagged. It actually is counterintuitive, but you want smoother footage. You want a tiny bit of blur in each of those individual frames in your 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. Now, in shooting in the daylight, even in a country like Iceland where it's regularly cloudy and overcast, it's very hard to get that shutter speed of something like 1/50 or 1/60. It's just too bright. That's the kind of shutter speed that you get in the blue hour. So having a variable aperture really does help with that. So quite often I do find myself having faster shutter speeds than I would like. Now, DJI have kind of given you a partial solution to this problem by including ND filters in the, I think it's just in the Fly More package, which I use a lot because they do help get the frame rate down, but I do miss having the variable aperture rate when it comes to shooting video. So what else can I say about this? Well, it uses OcuSync 2, which I find rock steady. The connection is rock steady. I haven't had any dropouts whatsoever. I've had the drone up to distances of about 1.5 kilometers when we've been flying out over the volcanic eruption. I never fly further than that. I'm not comfortable with flying further than that. And it was rock solid. And that was in a heavily magnetic area because the volcano is pumping out huge amounts of lava and magma. So I've been super confident with the connectivity. Another thing that I liked about it that I noticed is you don't need to do the compass calibration when you set up, so there's none of that kind of twisting around and trying to get the GPS. It connects to GPS really quickly, which means you can get the drone in the air very quickly when you arrive on the scene. There's a lot less messing around before you can be up flying and shooting video. So that's really great. In terms of the actual absolute image quality and doing a comparison, I'm traveling in Iceland at the moment, so I've not really had the opportunity to really look at the footage because I just have an iPad with me. But when I get back home to Portugal, I'll put some of that video up on the screen and have a little bit more of an in-depth look at the photo quality and the absolute video quality.
So let's start off by looking at some of the still images. Now this is a raw image straight out of the camera. You can see here, this was a really high dynamic range scene, lots of shadows, lots of really bright spots where the morning light was hitting the light, but we can really bring out the shadows here because the dynamic range on the sensor really is quite impressive. That's one of the benefits of having that 1-inch sensor. Now, if we zoom in just a little bit to look at the detail here, you can see there's just plenty of detail here in the trees. It really does produce a really nice image. And this is another image. This is one that I've already processed, and you can see here the detail in the boat is really nice. It really does produce lovely images. And as I said before, it does shoot in RAW, and it's important to shoot RAW images because this then doesn't apply sharpening and contrast and saturation. It doesn't let DJI's presets do that. You can do that on your own when you're looking at the image in Lightroom, and it allows you to apply your own levels of contrast and really bring out the best of an image. Now, when it comes to video, as I said before, you've got the exact same sensor that you got in the Mavic 2 Pro, so the video quality is pretty much exactly the same. You can see here, this is a clip shot in F-Log. I haven't done anything to this. and it was shot in relatively low light. There's quite high dynamic range here between the very dark shadows of the lava and the bright of the bubbling lava in the crater, and the sensor deals with it no problem at all. This is another scene here which has quite high dynamic range. This one I've actually edited a little bit, but you can see that the video has no problem between the brightness of the highlights and the darker shadows. Now, I've heard some people say that they think that the image is over sharpened when compared with the Mavic 2 Pro. Now, it's not something that I've noticed. I'm shooting an F-Log, and while I haven't shot the two drones side by side, this is pretty much the same location shot at a similar time of day. I really don't notice much of a difference in terms of sharpness. The actual output of the video cameras is almost identical for me. Now, you do get F-Log on the Air 2S, which is really important. It's important to shoot in F-Log. It's like RAW for video because it allows you to capture all of the data in the scene from the shadows to the highlights without any sharpening or saturation or contrast applied. That's something that you can do in post-processing using LUTs or whatever. And it just really allows you to get the footage to look the way that you want it to look and get it consistent across the different cameras that you're using. Now, a quick word about active tracking. Now, I don't use a lot of the features, but I do find Spotlight really effective. And it can be used on a person or on a vehicle, or even just a part of the landscape. You can basically use it to circle around a rock. And I found it much easier to access and use using the DJI Fly app than in the DJI Go 4 app, which the Mavic 2 Pro uses. You don't have to dive into menus or anything like that while you're flying the drone. You can just touch the screen, touch the part on the screen that you want the drone to circle around, draw a square around that, and the drone is going to lock on, and it's just super intuitive to use and really, really effective.
So overall then, I've been really happy with the Air 2S. In the month that I've been using it in Portugal, out on the coast where it gets really windy, and this last week in Iceland, where I've pushed it as far as I'm comfortable pushing drones, and it's never really let me down. It's super capable, the reception is capable, the distance, the battery life, its ability to handle wind, and the image quality, all of those things are great and every bit as good as the Mavic 2 Pro. I really do like the smaller size. I really do like the lighter weight. It's made a difference on some of the big long hikes that I've been doing. I find this really easy to just drop in my backpack when I'm going hiking out on the coast in Portugal. I also really appreciate the greater resolution, and the wider focal length is great for me because I shoot a lot of mountains. So it's excellent, but I do miss the sideways facing sensor. It's something that has given me a few concerns. But overall, I believe that if you're traveling light, if you're out there hiking, this is probably a better drone to get than the Mavic 2 Pro. It's really, really excellent. But I think that one of the things that people are going to be asking themselves when it comes to the Air 2S is whether to get this or to wait for the Mavic 3 Pro. Now, the specs of that have been leaked, and it's probably going to be out before the end of the year. So what we do know is that in terms of the resolution, both photography and in terms of the video, that the resolution is the same as the Air 2S, but it is going to have a bigger sensor, and that bigger sensor is probably going to give you slightly better dynamic range and better low light performance. And it's also going to have a longer flight time, something like 50% longer if the leak is to be believed. But the cost of that is that it's going to be heavier. That longer flight time is for sure going to be coming with bigger batteries. So I suspect with 3 batteries, you're going to be looking at something like double the weight of the Air 2S. And as well as that, it looks like it's going to be almost twice as expensive to buy. So you really have to ask yourself what your priorities are with the drone. For me, it looks very much like DJI are reusing the Mavic line to replace the old Phantom line with all of the top level specs with their highest performing relatively portable drone, whereas the Air line is more what the Mavic used to be, and that it's a portable drone with excellent video quality. Now, how good that video quality is, how good you need it to be, really depends on your personal use case. Now, for me, I'm not really interested in that. I was always happy with the video quality, with the photography quality of the Mavic 2 Pro. I don't really feel a need to upgrade that. It's good enough already. I don't look at the footage that I'm using, that I'm seeing, and think, oh, I wish this were better. I used to with the original Mavic, but certainly not anymore. So I'm not really interested in increasing the resolution or having better footage when I zoom into 200%. It's not going to make me happy with the video. Having a smaller and lighter drone does make me happier. So for me, this has been a really, really welcome upgrade, and I've been super happy with it. So I think that's it for this video. I hope it's been useful and I hope it's been interesting. If you've got any comments or any questions, just drop me an email or drop it in the comment box below and I'll definitely get back to you. Now, as I say, I'm in Iceland at the moment. If you'd like to join me on one of these workshops, on one of these photography trips, I'll be back in Iceland again next year and doing various other trips to places like Namibia and Lofoten. So I'd love you to join me on a workshop if you're interested in joining me and you like my photography. So check out my website. All the workshops that I do are listed there. And again, drop me an email if you're interested. And that's probably it. So thanks for watching, as always, and take care. See ya.